Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A new podcast which examines many important people and the important things in their lives, what they think about most current trends at the moment, what they think about certain subject matters, and of course, what their ideal world would be. Today's guest is Joseph Cohen, who is a pro-Israel activist, having previously co-founded the Campaign Against Antisemitism. He is now the current runner of the hit YouTube channel, the Israeli Advocacy Movement, of which combats anti-Israel viewpoints at both a street and a debate level. Hello?
Hello, Edward.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I
Okay.
like your flag.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming
What-
on. Yeah, I've got one of those as well, actually. Yeah, anyway, thank you for coming on. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, I hope you don't mind me using this colloquialism, is what was your red pill moment? What got you involved into political activism and what got you involved in politics in the first place?
So I don't really like the term red pill, but yeah, I've been into politics from a very young age. I was raised in a Marxist household,
Oh,
so we were raised on cornflakes, Marx, and Engels, and so yeah, we've been very politically active from a young age. So quite early on.
hmm. And what you said you start with Marx and stuff like that. You were raised in a Marxist household. What transitioned you from those sort of political views to well what you espouse now, or has it not really changed very much? So what
I
political evolution have you had?
I think that the biggest political awakening or movement I had would really be as I became more immersed in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I started to acknowledge how the Jewish people had shifted from being a victim, a nation who was seen as a victim, a people who were seen as a victim, and therefore held in very high regard by the left. The left showered the Jewish community in sympathy and were the first to campaign against anti-Semitism. But as I became more familiar with the Israel-Palestine conflict, I recognized something really weird happening, whereby those Jews that had been able to overcome their oppressors and liberate themselves as a nation and establish a Jewish collective, a Jewish nation, who was no longer seen as weak and vulnerable, that sympathy went away and was replaced with hatred. And for me, it really made me reflect on where I come from, the views I held. And I essentially now see the left, or certainly many on the far left, as basically viewing the world through who is strong and who is weak. And if they perceive you to be weak, like the Jews who perished in Auschwitz, then you're worthy of their sympathy and their solidarity. The minute you liberate yourself and throw off your tyrants, you're seen as powerful, and therefore you must be evil, you must be an oppressor. And so it was never based on values or justice. It was just based on who is strong and who is weak, which is a terrible way to view the world. And so looking at how the left looked at Israel helped me break free of that left-right binary. And I know I don't identify as being on the right. I don't identify as being on the left. They both have their own issues. But for me, that's really the thing that pulled me away from the socialist or the Marxist background I was raised with.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is to discuss what's been happening in Israel recently. So, for those who are unaware and not in the know, in layman's terms, what has been going on in Israel recently to those who are unaware of what's been happening recently in the last few months?
So in the last few months, you have effectively seen Hamas making a power move to effectively be seen as the leaders of the Palestinian people. And that involved provoking riots on the Temple Mount, which is the holiest site for Jews in the world and the third holiest site for Muslims in the world, provoking a riot on there, nearly burning down the Masjid al-Aqsa, the third holiest site in Islam. And then on the back of that, essentially launching a war from the Gaza Strip to Israel and raining down thousands of rockets on Israeli civilians. And so that was the start of the most recent flare up of violence, the Gaza war, which saw a number of casualties on both sides.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel like the mainstream media has been covering all these sort of issues? Because there's a lot of accusations from both sides that they are biased towards one way or the other. How do you feel about the sort of way the mainstream media has covered this, especially in Britain?
The mainstream media has a clear bias. And what I mean by that, in the week of the latest flare up, where unfortunately we did see a number of people killed, north of 200. People were killed in Gaza, the majority of whom were Hamas operatives. They put out, they basically have Telegram channels where you can go in, you can see all the dead, because they put out what's called the Shahid, the martyrs poster, where you'll see the person who was killed in all their military uniforms, holding guns, etc. So we know the people that were killed were largely Hamas and Islamic Jihad. During that same week, you had schools where dozens of children were massacred in Afghanistan. You had entire villages massacred in Burkina Faso. You had huge conflicts which saw many, many more people killed, and they weren't even mentioned in the Western press. So whether you believe the press is biased against Israel or in favor of Israel, what is inescapable is the huge bias that the media has in terms of the conflict. There are more journalists in Israel per capita than any other country. And it's because they can sit in the luxury of a five-star hotel, drinking their martinis and effectively reporting from a so-called war zone, which it truly isn't. That is one of the lowest death tolls in the world. From my perspective, and from most that pay attention to what the media is putting out, it is hugely biased against Israel. But obviously you hear echoes on the other side where they claim it's media biased against the Palestinians, which is absolutely bizarre when you look at how the conflict is framed.
Mm-hmm. And what ways is it biased against Israel mainly, would you say? Like, for those who are unaware of sort of like, what's going on? Like, in what ways is it biased against Israel, do you think?
So a great example would be there is a strong desire within many mainstream media publications to portray Israel as a pariah. And journalists will go to great lengths to paint this picture. So a great example would be the New York Times. The New York Times ran a cover where they listed 67 children and photographed them on the front cover, saying these are the children that were killed in a conflict, which is a very hard image to see because nobody wants to see dead children. It's one of the most horrible aspects of any conflict is that children die. Now, why am I bringing this up as an example? Because it perfectly demonstrates how the media is biased. So no other conflict, even those which directly involve America, like Afghanistan, Iraq, would the New York Times run a front cover listing the photographs of dead children? There's a reason they're doing this. They're calling out the children to say, look how barbaric Israel is. They kill Jews. Sorry, they kill children. And this is a medieval stereotype that Jews kill children. It used to be that Jews killed the Christian children so they could drink their blood. This is the modern version of this. Jews are baby killers. Look at what they're doing to poor Palestinian children. And then when you scratch the surface, you actually find out that, well, there were a number of those children that weren't actually children, but they were young. They were child soldiers. They were 17 years old, but they were Islamic Jihad. They were enlisted to fight Israel. They were killed in conflict. Others who were killed as unfortunately, as they were accompanying their father, who was a commander within one of the terrorist factions. And so there are a number of instances like this where, first and foremost, there hadn't been proper research into who these children were, how they came to die. The second aspect is then, well, why are we singling out Israel and listing the children when we don't do that with, or when the New York Times doesn't do that with any other conflict? And there's a reason for that, because there's a real appetite to paint Israel as a pariah, and to play on ancient stereotypes of Jews.
Mm-hmm. And do you think one of the reasons they might not be as critical of, say, Hamas and stuff like that is the fact that, well, possibility is the fact that a lot of these outlets being owned by sort of like liberal left-wing sort of thinking often are scared anyway about criticizing radical Islam, and given the fact that Hamas itself is a radical Islamist organization, do you think that might play into it, the fact that they're not particularly interested in covering radical Islam because they're a bit nervous about touching the subject, given the sort of implications, I suppose?
So I think there's definitely a unwillingness to speak openly about the conflict. So as an example, Hamas will be listed as militants rather than terrorists. And so if a terrorist in the West blows at Twin Towers, as an example, nobody would be nervous about calling the Al-Qaeda operatives that flew planes into the Twin Towers. No one would hesitate to call them terrorists. It was a terror attack. When similar attacks are carried out in Israel, there's a real fear to call them a terrorist. So they call them militants. And so I don't know if it's because of a liberal bias. I think it's bigger than that. I think there's definitely a problem on the left. I think there's definitely a problem of how the left views the conflict. They see Israelis as white European colonizers, ignoring the fact that the overwhelming majority of Israelis, well, all Israeli Jews originally come from the Middle East, but ignoring that in recent history, the majority of Jews that live in Israel today come from the Middle East and North Africa, and they are of a darker complexion. But that doesn't fit the narrative. The progressives want to paint Israel as white European colonizers because it suits their narrative. They're importing their politics and imposing it on a region where it has no place. Identity politics don't really work in the Middle East. The arguments you use in North America don't really apply to Israel and Palestine, or the Palestinians. And so, yes, I think the political views of many journalists, and potentially some of those that own or direct the publications, will definitely influence how they report on it. But I think the issue is actually much bigger than just one political stream of thought.
Is it that problem with covering sort of like the Middle East as a whole? Is that they're a bit about, you talking about like how they won't call Hamas terrorists, but they rather refer to them as Islamists? Do you think that's a problem with sort of like coverage of the Middle East as a whole? Because I remember watching a Question Time when they were discussing how the Muslim Brotherhood had come to power in Egypt following the Arab Spring, and they were talking about like if this had been a group in the West, instead of calling them like a militant group, they would have called them a fascist political party. Do you think that might be just a problem with Middle East coverage as a whole, that a lot of these Islamist groups are not called out for what they are because of like the geopolitics might be different, and therefore they don't want to be seen as insensitive, maybe?
I think it's more than wanting to be seen as insensitive. They stand in solidarity with the many. I mean, it depends who we're talking about. If we're talking about those on the far left, they will see those as oppressed people that are throwing off their colonial imperialist overlords, and therefore they stand in solidarity with their cause. And it's why you'll get someone like Jeremy Corbyn going out to the Middle East and saying that Hamas and Hezbollah are champions of social justice. I mean, what's social justice? Hamas, shortly after he issued that sentence, executed one of their commanders because he was accused of having gay sex. Like these, and that's by most social justice measures, executing gay men is really within the social justice values. But it's because they see Hamas and many of these other movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, as being anti-imperialist and therefore comrades.
And one thing I want to talk to you about, you brought the subject of Jeremy Corbyn, is one thing I found interesting over the last few years is the fact that a lot of these cranks on the left, who say they're not racist or whatever, they'll then suddenly reveal sort of like the more other prejudices. Because I remember watching a video of you where you were talking to a bunch of protesters, a bunch of far left protesters about a book that Jeremy Corbyn had forwarded, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the people you caught on camera said, "Well, the Jews have a lot of money, don't they?" How do you feel
Yeah.
when you encounter these sort of people who claim to be, non-racist and all the rest of it, and then say stuff like that on camera, knowing they're being filmed and so on?
I mean, the best thing about that, I think that particular gentleman was holding a sign that said "Fight bigotry." Like, wow, yeah, it's not real. It's just virtue signaling. It's just, look how virtuous I am. I'm against racism, yet I hold racist views against Jews. And so, how do I feel about that? I think one of the things that makes it more difficult when you hear racism directed at you as a Jewish person from the left is that the left are the ones that are supposed to be championing and standing by the oppressed. They're supposed to be the ones that are standing against racism and for equality. And so when a neo-Nazi says something anti-Semitic, it's kind of part and parcel. Like, your entire ideology is based on the fascism, actual fascism, and you belong to a movement that is responsible for the murder of millions of my people. I know you're going to harbor views. You proudly wear those views as a badge of honor. But when it comes from the far left, it's more difficult because they espouse values of equality and anti-racism. And so I think it makes it harder when you experience it from the far left, particularly as they're blind to it. Many of them believe they are genuinely against anti-Semitism and are completely blind to their own prejudices, which makes it even more frustrating.
And do you think that's become a more problem in recent years? Sorry, rather, I should reframe it. Well, do you think do you think it's become? Why do you think it's become such a problem in the last few years in terms of sort of like this more open sort of anti-Semitism, especially when you have people like that on camera saying this sort of stuff, which a few years ago we wouldn't have dared do, I assume, or you see sort of like the statistics about hate crimes against Jews going up. Why do you think that is? It just because of like sort of the way? Why do you think that is increasing then, very sadly?
So I don't think it's increasing. I think our awareness is increasing. I think social media, the phones have changed the world in the sense they've made everyday events recordable and then broadcastable, which didn't exist in history. If you actually go back to the older, let's go back to the patriarchs, the founders of socialism, of leftism, Proudhon, Marx, they all made anti-Semitic statements. Marx was one of his most famous comments. It was on a paper called "On the Jewish Question," and he said, "What is the God of the Jews? Money. What is their worldly religion? Usury," or something to that effect. I might be slightly misquoting it, but that's largely the gist. You go to Proudhon, 100 years before Hussein is one of the forefathers of anarchist thought and was a contemporary of Marx. They had rivalry. When you read what he said, it became where he'd made a diary, and I think it was in the notes in his diary, was that this is 100 years before the Holocaust. I can't remember the exact wording, but he effectively said that we need to expel the Jews from France. He said that like incredibly, I think he called us parasites. They incredibly, like, this could be quotes directly from Hitler, from Mein Kampf. It was on the same sort of level, and this is 100 years before the Holocaust, and so it's always been there. Anti-Semitism on the left has always been there. In Soviet Russia, it was there. In socialist Germany, it was there. It's always been there. What's changed is that we're able to now see everyday anti-Semitism from the left. And I think the other thing that's changed is that anti-racism has become one of the most important societal values that society holds, and so collectively. And so when we see instances of that, it's more likely to go viral as well. It's one of the prejudices which just is rightly really despised amongst most within society. So I think you have those two factors, that this is almost religiously followed, anti-racism, And when you couple that in with now we actually have more visibility of racism when it occurs, and we're just able to see more instances of left-wing anti-Semitism.
And one thing I wanted to ask as well is that the fact that why, in the case of Marx and some of his cohorts, given the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, Marx himself was Jewish or was of Jewish heritage, if I'm not mistaken, why, in the case, because of what he wrote, do you think that people like him and other Jews of his stature, maybe in that time and otherwise, were, by the what it sounds, sort of self-hating? Where do you think that sort of comes from? Because it just seems a bit weird. I don't know, maybe it's just me.
I don't think it's weird. I think it's quite natural. If you move away from something, if you actively reject something like the Jewish faith or the Jewish people, it's very easy to become fixated on the things that you don't like about that community. We find in Jewish history some of the greatest villains, those who inflicted the most persecution and pain on us, were actually Jews who'd left Judaism. So during the Inquisition, the chief inquisitor, who was responsible for literally ripping the flesh of Jews he suspected, or Jews who'd been forced to convert to Catholicism, who they suspected of secretly practicing their Jewish faith, whether they did or they didn't. The person who was responsible for that torture was Jewish. He was a Jewish convert to Catholicism. And so I think the Jewish history is full of Jews that rejected the Jewish people and then sided with the enemies of the Jewish people to inflict great pain upon us.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I wanted to talk with you about is the fact that your channel, the Israel Advocacy Movement, on your YouTube videos, I've seen quite a few of them. You often talk to a lot of these fringe people who are often either anti-Semites or lean that way. People like the former Generation Identity leader of the UK, Tom Dupree, or people like Mark Collett. You have these people on. How does that feel to sort of like take on these people? And how do you feel like sometimes in the case of Tom Dupree, they actually sort of, I think they, left the organization after because of like the stuff you were doing with them, or when sometimes it's successful, sometimes in the case of Mark Collett when it isn't, in terms of changing their minds. So the main things are like, how does it feel having these people on, and how do you feel like afterwards, whether they change their minds or not? Do you think, how do you feel about that?
So I think there's two aspects. First, there's the individual you're talking to, and then really when you're having a debate with someone, me and you are talking now, and it's enjoyable for the two of us. But really, we're talking to the audience. And I actually learned this from Muslims. The British Muslim community, basically, they have what's called dawah. And dawah is when you look to convert somebody to Islam. It's like Islamic outreach. And 100 years ago, a Muslim would encounter a non-Muslim and he would try to convince them of the strengths of Islam so that they would convert to Islam. And maybe, let's say I'm making the numbers up, but now maybe 1 in 50 people would be convinced by the arguments, take the Shahada and become a Muslim. What happened maybe a decade or so ago, they started filming, the Dawah crews in the UK started filming their interactions with non-Muslims. And so their success rate was probably similar. So if it was 1 in 50, 100 years ago, let's say it's still 1 in 50, or maybe it's even with the Enlightenment, well, not the Enlightenment, but with the modern era and the move to atheism, maybe it's even harder. So let's say it's 1 in 100 people now that are able to convert to Islam, but they filmed it. And that person, the arguments that convinced that one person, then was amplified to hundreds of thousands of people. And they were able to convert far, far more people via this mechanism. And it's exactly the same when you're interacting with the far right, when you're interacting, whether it's an Islamist anti-Semite, whether it's an alt-right to far right, it doesn't really matter where someone sits on the spectrum. You're first and foremost interacting with the individual, but you're also talking to the potentially millions of people who will watch that video. And so Tom Dupree was actually a really refreshing conversation in the sense that I went in there expecting a neo-Nazi, and I found someone who had views I didn't agree with, but he was far from a Nazi. And I'd like to think that the conversation that we had, and we had post, we had a couple of interactions on camera, and then we had conversations outside of that. I'd like to think I had something to do with him moving away from generation identity, which I think is riddled with actual Nazis, and I'd hope that I had some positive influence on Tom moving away from that. But who knows if I did or I didn't. I mean, Tom does, but outside of Tom, who knows?
And speaking more political stuff more broadly, how do you feel in terms of like the fact that, in terms of like the major political parties, like where they stand on all this sort of stuff, who do you think is probably the best advocate? Who's probably the most honest or best advocate for what's going on in the Middle East in terms of like speaking up for the truth and that's what's actually going on, as opposed to just generalizing with slogans? If you don't mind me asking, like, is there anybody, representative of either politics or the media who you think is legitimately, you know, goes from this without any sort of like baggage of bias or whatever, and actually tells the truth about this sort of stuff? Because it seems like a lot of people get lost in this stuff without learning the full facts.
So truthfully, I think when it comes to a political spectrum, I think nations act in their own interests. And so it doesn't matter how pro or anti-Israel somebody is in their ascent to power. I think as soon as you're in government, national interest will trump everything. I do think the current government we have is a strong ally of Israel. It could be stronger. I think they are much better at speaking truthfully about Hamas and the Palestinian leadership. But I think any British government is going to, and rightly so, any British government is going to act in the interests of the British people. And that's what they're there to do. I actually take more of a Jabotinsky type line, which is, with one exception, I will qualify this. If you have the intention as a Zionist of leaving your host nation and returning home to Israel, then it's not really your place to get too immersed in local politics, because you're sojourning here. You're a temporary stay. You're intending to go elsewhere, and it doesn't seem just to interfere in the politics of that nation. So that's why the only caveat to that is I'm part of the Jewish people, and so when it came to Corbyn and anti-Semitism, I actively campaign against Corbyn. And when it comes to the instances of anti-Semitism, then I will speak out. But as an organization, the Israel Advocacy Movement does not lobby, does not get involved in politics. We don't host politicians. We don't speak to politicians. I mean, we know a few, but it's not part of my agenda. I don't think, as an individual who intends to leave the UK and return home, I think it's best to leave British citizens, whatever their religion, Jewish or Christian or Hindu, Muslim, those that intend to stay here, it's best to leave the politics to them.
And on the subject of Labour again, do you think under Keir Starmer things have gotten better in terms of, say, stuff involving anti-Semitism, for example, or do you think it's just remained the same? Because one thing I noticed recently is the whole thing in battling to spend the upcoming by-election. They seem to be very focused on the Israel-Palestine issue up there, which, whether whatever view you might have on that, I'm not sure is really what a good chunk of the people there. I don't know. I'm not sure it's their number one priority. That I could be wrong on there. I think.
I mean, yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Coming from a northern village, I come from a mining village up north. I don't think many people cared about Palestine or Israel and I think Starmer's Labour Party is not Corbyn's Labour Party. Starmer is not Corbyn, but Starmer has inherited the mess that Corbyn has created, where you have a party which is riddled with anti-Semitism, where for whatever reasons, I mean, just to put it into context, the Palestinian conflict is the number one foreign policy issue for Corbynites. Yet the conflict last year saw 100 people killed on both sides. Comparing that to tens of thousands of people killed in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Mexico. Mexico had 8,000 people killed in drug wars. It's not an issue for most Corbynites. And so I think Starmer, I don't think he's anti-Semitic. I think he's clearly opposed to anti-Semitism, but he's inherited a party which is riddled with anti-Semites, which it will take over a decade to sort out again. And that's why you see Palestine popping up Yeah, it's crazy.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I wanted to ask you about your YouTube channel is the fact that some of the things you examine, like some of the anti-Semites you talk to, like some of them are really really odd and bizarre, like that Holocaust denier you talked to, the rapper, I can't remember his name, the one that was wearing the long hood or whatever and Speaker's Corner, whatever it was. What's it like to talk to some of these people who clearly, I don't want to sound too rude, are not all there, so to speak, for you sound just sort of a picnic? Like, what do you think that might be a lot of the reason there's a lot of this anti-Semitism, because a lot of these people are not particularly intelligent, so to speak, as
So
well?
I've got a video coming out, which is a little sneak preview. One of my videos went viral for the wrong reasons in Pakistan, and it was basically there's a pro-Palestine Palestinian activist called Ahmed Zahar, and he'd made a video showing how Syria didn't recognize Palestine, and so I made a spoof video where I made Siri explain that there'd never been a country called Palestine, which is a fact. There's never been a country called Palestine. It was clearly a spiel, clearly a joke, clearly like only an idiot would believe that Siri was saying the things that I was saying. But it caused such a backlash in Pakistan that the video was viewed hundreds of thousands of times, and it triggered a boycott from many Pakistani Muslims who were like, "This is outrageous! Syria is a Zionist! Like, we need Hitler!" Like, just the worst comments you could imagine. But because they're clearly not that intelligent, clearly they didn't realize that you can program a computer to say whatever you want a computer to say, and it's a real problem in my field. I find that a lot of the people, I think there's two camps. There are those who harbor, there are three camps actually. There are those who harbor anti-Semitic thoughts because they're simple, and I debate a lot of them. So I'm speaking from experience. There are others that are coming from a place of ignorance. They don't know Jews. They've only been exposed to one side of the narrative, and with those people, you can actually have very meaningful conversations. And on the other side are those that are actually very informed or informed enough, and they still harbor prejudices. And so I think an awful lot of my time, and many people in this in my field, a lot of our time is taken up speaking to people that aren't that intelligent because they believe that Syria is a Zionist and should be boycotted, which is
Very smart people there. Anyway, another thing I wanted to discuss is like on your YouTube channel as well, you talk about the Democrat from the United States, Rashida Tlaib, and a lot of the stuff that she says about Israel and some of the stuff she says about Hanukkah and whatnot. Do you think there is a possibility that the Democrats, if more Rashida Tlaibs get elected, for example, and some of these other people in there, might start to have a problem with anti-Semitism as well, the same way sort of like the Labour Party is dogged with, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think the squad. So for those that don't know, the squad was originally Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Aina Presley, and who am I missing?
Alexandra Cortez.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the main one, AOC. And now you've got Cory Bush and I've forgotten the other gentleman's name, Jamal Bowman. Is that right? But anyway, that's the squad, and they're progressive, socialists, Democrats, and certainly with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, there's some very problematic things that they've said in the past, which I believe are anti-Semitic. I think many people share my thoughts. But I think the Democratic Party as a whole is not anti-Semitic and is a long way from being there. I don't think it's as hostile to Israel as many are sensationalizing. But if more like Rashida and it was more like Rashida and Ilhan were to come along, then yes, there'd be a real problem. But they're definitely a minority within the Democratic Party today, and long may it stay that way.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I also wanted to ask you about the YouTube stuff is like one of the things you talked about is sort of like these verified anti-Semites on Twitter, people like Nick Griffin and so on. Why is it that do you think that these people are, verified and so on Twitter, and all these sort of people are entertained? Meanwhile, there are probably people who are far less extreme than that, like Project Veritas, who get suspended, for example. Do you think there might be like a sort of weird double standard on there, while like people like Nick Griffin are on Twitter and verified and stuff like that, but then you have some of these more moderate people were kicked off or whatever. Like again, Project Veritas being one of them, or Rose McGowan was kicked off very briefly because she dared to speak about some of these disgusting people in Hollywood, for example. Do you think there might be a weird double standard there, or do you think Twitter are not particularly bothered, so they're just not looking, or I don't know?
No, I think so. First of all, I think it depends who we're talking. So I think, for instance, Twitter are very aware of Khomeini. They're very aware of Farah Khan. They're very aware of certain personalities because of the size and the influence, and they would keep them on the platform, even though they're clearly in violation of their community standards. And I think others are removed because they are a greater threat to a certain political philosophy or the political side within American politics, and only in American politics. These rules are only really applied there, or certainly to English-speaking areas of Twitter. So, for instance, homosexuality and homophobia is a great example. So, if you are homophobic, if you misgender someone, if you make any slip up like that, or not slip up, but if you make any comment like that on Twitter, in an English-speaking Twitter, you're off Twitter. If you make those same same statements in a Muslim majority country, then you're allowed on the platform. And so there's a huge double standard. And I think we're feeling this because, or we're witnessing things like Project Veritas versus Khomeini because we're sitting in the West and we're looking at how Twitter arbitrarily applies this. I mean, as a Zionist, hugely big tech are my biggest pain. Like I do, to put some perspective to that, I can release a video on Twitter and it will be viewed 3 million times. That same video will be viewed 500 times on YouTube. And this was at a time when I had more subscribers on YouTube than I had followers on Twitter. And the algorithms actively work against Zionist content. So if you are pro-Israel, like social media is the bane of your life.
One other thing I wanted to talk about is also is the fact that why do you think some of these people are so still popular? Some of these anti-Semitic types, like the most obvious example I can think of is the fact that Louis Farrakhan, for example, the American Nation of Islam head, is still very popular over there. Like a lot of like rappers cite him as like a hero of theirs, or you see people like Maxine Waters hugging him or whatever. Even though this dude's an anti-Semitic, anti-white racist, why do you think people like him are still so popular though? Is it just because he spouses the right views on some issues, but on some of these other things, it's just footnotes, I guess, for them, I suppose, ends justify the means and all that.
So, truthfully, I'm not quite sure why Farrakhan. I mean, if I was to go really simplistic, I would imagine it's to do more with how people perceive the bigotry of low expectations. And if you belong to certain communities, your views, however reprehensible they may be, are more likely to be accepted because you belong to that community and you're maybe standing in solidarity against a common enemy. So an experience I'm much more familiar with is the Israel-Palestine space. And so I will often see Marxists, progressive, socialists standing shoulder to shoulder with the Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb ut-Tahrir, or I'll go to, I remember one of my favorite videos I ever made. I went to a Queers for Palestine, or Queers for BDS, sorry, protest, and I filmed them. And I asked them the most basic questions about what are their thoughts on the treatment of LGBT people in Gaza. And I've never thought about that. Well, maybe you should think about that. You're saying you're queers for BDS, like gay Palestinians flee to Israel for sanctuary. Maybe if you actually do care about the LGBT community in the Palestinian territories or the areas that the Palestinian Authority are operating in, maybe you should consider their well-being. Maybe actually execute gay people. And maybe you should actually then see how gay people live in Israel, where you have Pride and you have Tel Aviv and you have the gay capital of the Middle East. And so the reason I'm giving this as an example is that on this, this was Queers for Palestine. There were both gay, there are people that belong to the gay community or the LGBT community and allies. And all of them were standing shoulder to shoulder with people who despise gay people to the extent that they murder them or want to see them murdered if they are in a same-sex relationship in the Middle East. And so I think there's a blindness. I think it's a bigotry of low expectations. And I think it's the belief that there's a shared common enemy, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, any of the isms, except communism.
And one of the other things I want to ask you is that one of your YouTube videos talks about like how there are certain books on Amazon like that are dangerous and so on, and you think maybe that perhaps shouldn't be sold or something like that. You talk about like Mein Kampf, for example, some of the stuff that Alfred Rosenberg wrote. As much as like these texts may be deplorable and detestable and lead to a lot of bad, to put it mildly, bad things happening. Surely it's important like these things are historical documents, maybe, or do you think it should be more like they should be in libraries as opposed to being sold in the general public, for example?
My position is very, very, very simple. If you are going to police speech, if you're going to police content, then you have to apply that equally. And so if you are not allowed to publish, if, for instance, you're going to pull a Dr. Seuss book because it's seen as being racist, but you're going to list Mein Kampf, then maybe you should be applying that standard liberally. If you want to say, actually, we could believe in complete free speech, or these are historical, whatever your angle is, I'm fine with that. I'm actually not against material being available. But if you are censoring and you're leaving one community vulnerable, then I want to see it applied with equality. So I don't want to live in a world or shop on a marketplace where Dr. Seuss is banned, but Mein Kampf is fine. It just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think and also on that sort of stuff? Do you think that's becoming another sort of like big problem as well in terms of like canceling books, like with the stuff with Dr. Seuss, for example, and the stuff with I think Dave Pilkey, the Captain Underpants author, had one of his books withdrawn or taken out of print. What do you think that has become such a thing where it's now become, sort of popular again to burn books, so to speak, whether it's Dr. Seuss or whether it's Dave Pilkey, in the case of Dr. Seuss, he's not alive to defend himself, of course. So there's that. I'm not sure if that's cynical or not, but maybe that's just I don't
know. I think it's about power. It's power, and it's a very, very effective way of shifting the culture of a society is to limit what is permissible within it. It's a very easy way for a small number of loud voices to influence major corporations. If you get 1,000 emails complaining that you're listing a racist book or whatever it may be, you're very likely to listen to that, even if 1,000 people is a drop in the ocean of how many sales you make, and in no way reflects the views of your average customer. It doesn't matter, because the other customers aren't writing in 1,000 or 10,000 letters about something else. And so it's very, very easy to influence a company's policies with a very small number of vocal voices. And so that's why I think it's about power, and it's a very easy tactic for people to apply.
Do you think social media might have helped sort of like this sort of echo chamber performance maybe helped organize the mob in a better way than they have in the past? Because it's a little bit more of a contained space, for example, as opposed to having to actually like build groups in the past on the ground, I suppose. Do you think social media has probably made the problem of fanaticism worse in this sense, I suppose?
I don't think cancel culture has made fanaticism or echo chambers worse, or maybe it has, but I think they would still be there. Technology has enabled us to create communities around very specific identities and themes. And so whereas in the past you lived in a city, maybe one or two people shared your particular political view, maybe you were a goth, maybe you were a Marxist, but like you were talking a small number of people that you actually had access to. So technology has changed that. You can now reach millions of people. So what becomes a small number of people can suddenly, you can join up and form networks around the world and grow and influence more people and create those echo chambers. So I think, technology more than cancel culture has created echo chambers.
Mm-hmm.
And human nature, certainly modern human nature, contemporary human nature.
Sure. And one thing, do you think one thing to maybe solve fanaticism is actually to perhaps promote the, freedom of more ideas and so on, and push some of this stuff out? Like, for example, I remember watching a PragerU video where a guy was talking about the fact that he was stridently anti-Israel because of all the stuff he'd been taught while growing up. But then once he went to a bookstore and read Alan Dershowitz, The Case of Israel, he changed his mind and so on. And then he actually went to Israel and he became a staunch defender. Do you think, whether it's sort of like on the Israel question or just in general, surely the solution is to perhaps, promote more of of the truth, or just more information in general? Why do you think there's not many people speaking up for that? And if so, public life, I suppose. Why do you think it's just limited to, again, the fanatics? Is it just because people are just scared of what the fanatics might do to them, or maybe is it just a matter of a lot of these people don't care?
So I'm not sure I follow the question. Can you just reframe the question?
Oh, okay. Essentially, the whole thing about like fanaticism, whether it's like anti-Israel fanaticism or cancel culture and so on. Surely what the solution should be to, encourage the spread of more information and more truth and stuff like that. Why do you think there's so few people in public life who, speak on that side? It seems like whenever this sort of stuff happens, people just like, oh, this is terrible, but don't do anything about it. They just go, oh, it's bad, especially with this current government. Do you think it's just a matter of they are either too scared of the fanatics or they just don't particularly care, I suppose?
I think it's modern. I think people don't want to leave the comfort of their community, their echo chamber, call it what you will. So if you are raised on a narrative that Israel is a pariah state, and everybody in your social circle, or those that you politically align with, is saying the same thing, and with most of these things, there's compelling arguments. So if you are pro-Palestinian, there are compelling arguments against Israel. And most people don't have an appetite to challenge the views that they're either raised on or they've adopted, but the views that are central to their identity. Most people don't want to change that. And I think that's it's not the biggest issue, but I think that's why you don't see this movement. And I think from a Zionist perspective, from a Jewish perspective, one of the most bizarre things for us to see is this little tiny conflict in the Middle East with a very, very low death toll is suddenly central to your leftist identity. If you are on the left, you are pro-Palestinian. It's just the weirdest thing to see, because there are so many more regimes that have had much bloodier conflicts, that have raged for far longer, that are so much more messy, but nobody bats an eyelid about them. And I think most people that sit on the left are quite comfortable with that, because there are convincing arguments for why you should be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. And so there's not that willingness to look further, because there's no incentive, there's no motivation to do that. The only thing you're going to invite into your life is pain. It's like having to leave a political camp is, particularly in today's day and age, if you're an American and you're a Democratic family and you decide to vote Trump, that's it. Like, you're not invited for Thanksgiving next year. It's and so most people don't want to invite that level of pain into their life. So they'll maybe be very critical and open about things that aren't central to that identity. But most people don't want to rock the boat.
Mm-hmm. On that, in terms of like the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, like for anyone who wants more factual, more unbiased looks at the event, what sort of like media outlets or materials would you recommend for people who might be interested in this sort of stuff but aren't particularly swayed by either side of the fence, or who look at the media and think it's a bit oversimplified? Like, what sort of books or media outlets would you recommend in terms for a proper understanding of this of the subject matter?
The most unbiased and reliable media source you could go to is the Israel Advocacy Movement on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. But outside of that, no, I would recommend reading. So I think the only way to get an unbiased picture is truthfully by going to both sides. And the more familiar you become with the conflict, the more you'll be able to pick apart you'll be able to pick out the truth from the propaganda, because We don't have journalists anymore. We have activists. We don't have historians anymore. We have activists. But everyone is an activist. Everyone is trying to convince you. I think, for instance, if you go to historians, I think it's really important if you want to learn the Israel-Palestine conflict, you have to go to the history. You have like the old Zionist historians, and then you have the new historians, and you should familiarize yourself with all of them. You should go to Benny Morris, Ephraim Karsh. I could list so many places you should go. But I would say pick a right-wing source, pick a left-wing source, pick an Israeli source, pick a Palestinian source, and go to both of them, because it's the only way you'll pick a neutral. You'll be able to find a more neutral and unbiased position, because everybody, including myself, is pushing politics. Is that my incentive? But with millions of people watch our video, and it's very clear. My biggest bias is the survival of the Jewish people. That motivates everything that I do. Therefore, I am going to be seeing the conflict through a biased lens. So if you consume my media, you have to consume it knowing it. This is a Zionist narrative. This is a Jew who's concerned about Jewish survival. Therefore, the content is going to be framed around that. If you're consuming Palestinian content, they're going to be coming with a very different agenda. Their agenda could be they want to see the replacement of Israel with a binational state or a Palestinian state, or they want to see the right of return for the Palestinian refugees. And so you're going to get very, very different stories from the two different camps. So the only way to get neutral is to go to both, because there's nobody in the middle. The center's gone. It's certainly with Israel, Palestine, it's just polarized.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I wanted to ask you, maybe if this is too big a question, forgive me, but you're talking about like, what do you think would be like perhaps like the best solution to the whole conflict in general? Like, what do you think? Would it be better to be like a one-state or a two-state solution? And how would either scenario in your mind play out for a more peaceful coexistence, I suppose?
I truthfully have no idea. What I like to say is I'm solution agnostic. I would support any solution that brings lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. One of the biggest frustrations with this conflict is people outside of the region pushing their idea of a solution on the people of the land. And so you will hear people in the West constantly pushing two-state, 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 two-state. And you hear people on the ground, both Israelis and Palestinians, saying, we don't want two-state. Doesn't work. It's dead. Oslo's behind us. We need to find a new solution. And so there are many different options. There's a federation, there's two-state, there's binational one-state, there's population transfers. There's a million different solutions on the table, and truthfully, I could back most of them with caveats. I don't think any solution should result in the creating refugees, as an example. So many people who advocate for a two-state solution in the West do so believing that there will be 500,000 Jewish refugees from Judea and Samaria from the West Bank. I think that's a very moral solution. And so for me, I'm solution agnostic. If I had the answer, I'd be writing books and I'd be earning a lot more money than I am today. And I'd be on the phone to Bennett advising him on what the best path forward is for both peoples. But I don't have that solution. So for now, I can back any solution that ensures peace and security for both people.
Do you think that the current, the new Israeli government, this coalition between all these several parties, is going to be better? Is going to help to is going to be better in getting like a more peaceful solution or not? Or what do you, which political group in Israel do you think might be, have the solution to the answer? Do you think it's this current administration, or do you think there needs to be someone else who comes in? What's your opinion, do you think?
So I think the current government has the potential to be a breath of fresh air, in the sense that you have representation like never before. You want diversity of opinion. You have far left all the way to pretty right wing in the same government. You have Arab to Jew in the same government. It's like, I mean, when I say an Arab part, I mean literally the Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't get more Muslim and more Arab than the current party that's sitting in government in Israel at the moment. And so with that has the potential for some real shake-up. So already the left-wing party, the far-left party, have invited a huge advocate of BDS to speak at the Knesset. I don't know how that's going to get done with Bennett and the right-wing bloc. It's like, if they're able to hold a coalition together, which it's really in their interest to do that, because certainly for Bennett, who's the current prime minister, he's seen as by many who voted for him as a traitor. So if his term ends prematurely, that's his political career over. So it's in their interest to make this work for all of them, because they were like the left in Israel had been decimated up until recently. They were in the wilderness and suddenly they're in government. And so I think we have the potential for real change if they can hold it together for longer than 2 months, because the coalition has a high chance of breaking down just because of the extreme opposing political positions of the different parties that make up the current government.
And on that, what do you think of Benjamin Netanyahu's time in power? Like, given the fact that he spent over a decade in power in the late 2000s to like now, and also spent some time as prime minister in the 90s. What do you think of his performance? What do you think of his performance as prime minister, given these most recent guy just left office?
So it depends how you measure. So if you measure it with peace with the Palestinians, not so great. Economy is doing really good. Peace with Arab neighbors, phenomenal. He signed more peace treaties than any other Israeli prime minister, which is absolutely phenomenal. So it depends how you measure success. I think he's been good for Israel. I think he's been good for the economy. He's been good for the region as a whole. But I do also believe it was probably time for him to go, just because of just the stalemate that the country was now in. But I'm not one of these people who sees Netanyahu as the pariah. Like, he basically did everything that the West asked of him. He froze settlements. He did everything that you could imagine from the Israel position, in the sense of creating peace deals with Arab states, growing the economy. So yeah, I think he has largely been a positive force for the evolution of Israel as a nation state.
And one of the final questions I wanted to ask is the fact that all these Arab nations who were once very hostile to Israel, countries like Sudan, countries like Morocco, I think has also done one, and some of these other countries are now signing peace deals. How do you feel about that? Do you think how do you feel that so many of them have essentially signed in the last year and a half? And do you think this is going to be a lasting sort of sense of change? And do you think this is a sign of good times, or good tidings and good omens for what's to come for Israel's future?
So I think one of the biggest factors to this was Obama and Iran, and effectively the Obama regime pushed with the softening of the stance with the Iranian regime, which is incredibly expansionist, and kind of pushed the Gulf states and many Muslim states into the arms of the Israelis. So I think as long as Iran has expansionist ambitions which threaten the security of its neighbors, those neighbors have much more to gain by working with rather than against the state of Israel. I think the many of these states have given billions of dollars to the Palestinians, only for it to be squandered to go on private planes, palaces. Then I think many of them have had enough. The conflict's been going on for over 70 years. There is every opportunity for peace the Palestinians have turned down. And so I think many of the Muslim states have tired of that and recognize that actually not only are we not really gaining anything from the Palestinians, but they're now siding with Iran, which is our biggest enemy. And so I think if things continue on this track for long enough, then the animosity that existed 73 years ago, is not going to exist in another decade. So I think because of the actions of the Obama regime, because of the expansionist intentions of Iran, I think, yes, the relationships have a chance of solidifying and standing the course. And on a personal level, I'd like to see something like we saw happen within Christendom. Within Christendom, Christianity was deeply anti-Semitic. The persecution that Christians inflicted upon their Jewish neighbors was like just savage. There's no other word of describing it. It was barbarism. And you look at today, Christians are the strongest supporters of Israel, amongst the strongest of supporters of Israel, particularly evangelicals in America. And I think you could see a very similar awakening within the Muslim world, where they realize actually we don't need to be against the state of Israel. There's actually, you can even turn to Islamic scripture and make the case for Israel and there are many Muslims that do this. So I'd like to see not only a softening of the hostilities between Israel and its neighbors, but a strengthening of the support of Zionism and the Jewish people in that land amongst the Ummah, or the Muslim community at large.
Mm-hmm. And the penultimate question I wanted to ask you, because this is the title of the show and it's what I ask all the guests, what would your ideal world be?
Wasn't expecting that. I don't like chasing utopia. I think the utopia tends to lead to very, very, very dark places, and so I guess I don't have an answer. It's really, I don't like utopia. I don't think mankind is capable of creating utopia. And I think when people try to create utopia, it almost inevitably ends in the suffering of others. And I think that's one of the things that Herzl and many early Zionist writers wrote about, was when we come to create our state, we mustn't fall into the trap of trying to create a utopia, because it's not going to happen. So I could give you the soppy answer and say a kumbaya type answer where there's global peace, we forge our guns into plows and we all hold hands and live happily ever after. But I don't think that's likely. And so for that case, I just maybe slightly less conflict, slightly more love. But it's, yeah, truthfully, I don't like chasing after utopia.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and thank you for coming on. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is that for anyone who wants to find more about you and about your work, where can they go? Where can they find you?
Yeah, the Israel Advocacy Movement. We're on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us on israeladvocacy.net. And yeah, I appreciate any follows, subscribes, likes. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming on. And yeah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the Ed Interviews YouTube channel, and also the Ed Interviews BitChute channel, and also look at my stuff on Mixcloud as well. I have more of this content coming in, and also subscribe to my Patreon subscribe star as well for more guest requests, as well as free copies of my old books. Until then, see you next time, guys.